Hello and welcome to Unexplained UFO Encounters. UFO and alien sightings/encounters occur on almost a daily basis from every part of the world. It seems that no area has been left unvisited by these strange beings, from the polar ice caps to the smallest of towns. While, for the most part, these reports follow a distinct pattern that isn't really unique, I can't say that they aren't still fascinating on their own regards, due to it still focusing attention on something that is largely unknown. However, there are a handful of sightings that step away from the crowd and plead for more investigation due to how odd they are or how much concrete evidence there is. So with today's topic, we are searching the skies for information on the unknown. Our first story comes from a small town in Wisconsin called Elmwood. This location is a quiet setting that has quaint homes, but for the most part is predominantly farmland. However, this made it for the perfect hotspot for a rash of UFO sightings during the 70s. Reports still occur today, but it isn't as frequent as it was in the past. George Wheeler was a police officer during this time and had seen a UFO as well previously. It also helps to mention that George previously was a combat pilot during World War II, so he was fairly well versed in what is normal to be in the sky and what shouldn't be. Outside of his own sighting, he responded to a few of the UFO reports the residents had called in. In April of 1976, Officer Wheeler was out patrolling the area when he noticed a bright orange glow appearing to emanate from a quarry at Tuttle Hill. Thinking it might be simply a fire, he called into the station stating that, "Looks like we got a fire out here. I'm going to investigate." Once he drove up the hill to get a better look, he quickly realized that what he at first thought was a fire was something completely different. Officer Wheeler got on the radio again and said, "My God, it's one of those UFOs again." After regaining some composure, he radioed the dispatcher with a description of what he was seeing. He said it was huge, the size of a two-story house. It was about 250 feet across, was silver in color, had portholes around the perimeter where you could see shadows moving around behind them, and it had a strange orange beam of light coming from the dome on top. George stated that the light was so bright that it hurt his eyes to look at it. After giving this description, the craft slowly lifted off and he heard a loud whoosh sound. As it took to the sky, it sounded a bright blue light beam which hit the officer's car. The officer's radio went dead at the same time. The dispatcher became worried with how suddenly the radio cut out and began frantically calling, "George, can you hear me? Are you alright?" But there was no response. At this same time, a local dairy farmer named David Moots was driving down the road when he came across a patrol car sitting in the middle of the road with all its lights out. David approached the car to find Officer Wheeler slumped over in the seat, unresponsive. Mr. Moots tried over and over again to get a response, and finally George began moving around slowly and seemed delirious. David asked, "What is wrong, George?" And after some time he responded with a fearful voice, "I've been hit. Get me to a radio." David asked, "By a car?" And the officer said shakily, "No, by one of those UFOs." That same night, the chief of police, Gene Helmer, was sitting at home listening to the police radio when he heard Officer Wheeler's calls. Gene set out to help the officer and found David attending to Mr. Wheeler. Gene stated that when he saw George, the look he had was one that he had never seen a man look as terrified as he was. It also is worth noting that at least 5 other witnesses described seeing something odd in the sky at the same time. In one report, a farmer's TV lost signal abruptly, and at another farm, the dogs were acting strangely. On later inspection, the vehicle was found to have had all its points in the distributor burnt off, and the starter was messed up. Keep in mind the car had just been tuned up the prior week. 2 hours after this incident at 1 a.m., George's wife took him to the hospital. They kept him 3 days, but all the tests came back showing everything was normal. A few days later, Officer Wheeler returned to the hospital, complaining of severe headaches, terrible nightmares, and oddly enough, no recollection of the details of his encounter. Again, tests were run, but everything came back fine. Not long after this, George's health began to deteriorate rapidly, and sadly only 6 months after his encounter, this man passed away. I should note here that tests were run again and nothing was found. Whatever happened that night has never been explained, but it does appear the UFO that was seen used a beam that affected electronic devices, sadly, including the human body. During times of war, it seems that UFO sightings are more prevalent than most any other time. Many assume this is an attempt from the aliens to stop many of these engagements from happening. This comes up with things such as the Foo Fighters of World War II, the famous Battle of LA, the World War I regiment that disappeared in a fog, and even recent pilot radio surveillance. During the Korean War, a UFO sighting came out that was so fantastic that I had to include it here. In May of 1951, Private First Class Francis P. Wall and his regiment were stationed at Chorwan. While making plans for battle, they noticed a strange craft floating down from the mountains that looked like a jack-o'-lantern. The craft flew down to a village that the troops had begun bombarding with artillery fire. This is when things took a real odd turn of events. The craft appeared to keep flying in the way of the artillery fire, but it remained unharmed. It then quit glowing orange and started to pulse a bluish-green color as it began to approach the troops. Wall then requested to use armor-piercing rounds to shoot this object. Once the use was granted, the bullets hit their target, but it still remained unharmed. In fact, Wall stated that they almost seemed to bounce off the hull with a distinct dinging sound. The craft then began to fly around in an erratic side-to-side fashion, and its lights were now blinking on and off. This is when the UFO started to attack the troops with a beam of light that was emitting pulses. The ray was described as being almost invisible unless it was pointed right at a person. This light beam produced immense amounts of heat that was described as being blistering in temperature. The men quickly retreated to a bunker where they watched the craft continue to use its weapon until it finally shot up into the sky at a 45-degree angle very quickly. Wall, along with his fellow soldiers, agreed not to report their sighting due to thinking that they would lock every one of us up and think we were crazy. Francis would later break this pact once his symptoms from the events began to surface. Mr. Wall went from 180 pounds to 138, had lifelong stomach issues, loss of memory, and fits of disorientation. The symptoms that the men later described having were likened to the effects of radiation. This wasn't a one-time event, however, since by the end of the war, at least 42 reports, all describing the same thing, were mentioned by other soldiers. What is even more interesting is that all these sightings came with other eyewitnesses seeing the same thing. Some have tried to discredit Mr. Wall's sightings, claiming it was a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, but that doesn't excuse the other 42 reports. Some say advancements in radar technology had eliminated a lot of the UFO sightings, but again, I didn't read anywhere where any of these men were using radar. At the end of the day, the case is unsolved, and it is very interesting. I must also mention that after looking into this story, I seem to recall hearing another one that was quite similar, but it involved a UFO chasing a boat down, shooting green lights at the soldiers during Vietnam. I will have to look into that one for a later video. It is at this point that I originally wanted to talk about the UFOs seen flying over the White House in 1952, but due to time, I opted for a more fascinating story. I am thinking about including it in an upcoming video about the sham that was Project Blue Book. Our final story is quite famous, as well as it is quite intriguing. It is known as the Falcon Lake incident, and I have been wanting to talk about it for quite some time now. Our story starts with a 51-year-old industrial mechanic named Stefan Miculek, who lived with his family in River Heights, Winnipeg. Stefan was a military police officer in Poland before moving his family to Canada. In his new home, Stefan took to a side hobby of prospecting for quartz and silver, which he frequently did in an area called Falcon Lake. On May 20th, 1967, Mr. Miculek took a weekend trip to mine his claim. While enjoying nature, he was suddenly startled by the sound of geese honking in fright for no apparent reason. It was at this point that he looked to the sky and saw two silver cigar-shaped craft that had a reddish glow hovering nearby. One of the objects slowly came down on a rock ledge and mysteriously morphed into a typical saucer shape. The other UFO hovered for a while longer before finally flying out of sight. In an odd turn of events, Stefan automatically assumed that what he was looking at was a secret military aircraft, so he sat back and started drawing a picture of what he was seeing. After half an hour, he finally decided to get a closer look at the mysterious craft. As he approached, he could smell a strong sulfur odor coming from the object, and he heard the whirring sound of an engine along with the hissing sounds of escaping air. Upon further inspection, he noted that a door was open in the side and it was shrouded with bright light. The muffled sounds of beings talking could be heard emanating from inside the craft. Stefan called to the beings offering his help, but there was no response. He even tried talking to them in Polish, Russian, and even German, but no reply was ever given. Stepping closer, he noted that the craft's shell was seamless in design, and he put his goggles on to get a better look at the open hatch. Inside, there was no one to be found, but there were panels everywhere with blinking lights. Suddenly, 3 panels slid across the open door and sealed the craft from his prying eyes. Stefan reached out to touch the saucer, but it was so hot it burned through the tips of his gloves he was wearing. Suddenly, the craft began to spin counterclockwise, and out of a grid-like panel near him, steam or gas came out, hitting him in the chest, and it pushed him backwards and set his shirt on fire. Stefan tore his shirt from his body and stood disoriented from the gas as the craft flew away. Mr. Miculek stumbled through the forest for a while, stopping to vomit every so often, but did manage to make it back to his hotel room. Once there, he went to the hospital and was treated for his burns, which would later rise up in a strange grid-like pattern. Following the event, he experienced weight loss, headaches, diarrhea, and periods of blackouts. While resting in his bed, it was said that the smell of sulfur and something burning was seeming to seep from Stefan's pores. A year later, Stefan visited the hospital for help with his symptoms, and afterward, he was asked to talk to a psychologist. The results of that visit were that he was very pragmatic and down to earth, and not the kind of person to make up stories. In the aftermath, the family would be inundated with all kinds of visitors, including journalists, sightseers, and more importantly, military officials. An in-depth investigation was done in the site where the UFOs were seen. Circular brown spots were found in the soil where all the vegetation had died, and the soils and rocks were shown to be radioactive. Strange pieces of metal were found melted to the rock, one of which the family still has, and it is still radioactive. Stefan died at the age of 83, and never once did he change his story, but in the same regards, he never assumed the craft was extraterrestrial. He always said he had no reason to believe it was alien, but in the same token, he didn't have proof that it wasn't. I want to add one thing before moving on. Just something that bothers me. I was looking at his shirt that was recovered and the burns on his chest. It seems like the placement is way off to me. The shirt shows burns around the chest, like his story describes, but his photos in bed show them on his stomach. To go a step further, the burn marks on the shirt have a box outline. In fact, there are 2, but one with dots, but the other without, as if they are overlapping. Like a hot plate was pressed on it. I have no reason to not believe the story, and from all accounts he was an honorable man, but I just wanted to point out those issues I have with the evidence. Take it for what you will. So as I end this topic for today, I was curious about your thoughts on these strange UFO sightings and encounters. Do you think there is a more terrestrial explanation behind them, or do you think these are the most interesting stories out there? Keep in mind that at no point do I assume that these crafts couldn't be human-made as well. Also, I would love to hear if any of you have had any interesting experiences with UFOs. Now it is at the point of the week where I share some comments from the previous video that I loved. I hope I say this one right. LethixX said, "Nice video. It looks like your channel is getting more attention. I really hope so. Your content is always awesome." Thank you, LethixX. I am glad you enjoy my content, and I have noticed quite a few new people coming to my channel. It still is hard for me getting my head around how many people watch my stuff and are subscribed to me. I remember getting my first organic 20 subscribers and being amazed by that. Jan Quinn said, "This one was the most bizarre video that I've ever heard you tell about. You are the most thorough researcher I've ever seen. Good work." A heart emoji. Thank you, Jan Quinn. Yes, the video on the Otterman creature was certainly strange. In fact, it was a topic I was unaware of until a subscriber suggested it to me. I appreciate the comment about being thorough in my research. I really try hard to get as much information together as possible, and in the same time, trying to keep factual with all the accounts. Robin Nunya says, "Aw, Ben, how can you not like a cryptid that looks like an otter? LOL. Geez, you Americans say Australia is a dangerous place, and we do not even have ottermen. We do, however, have yowies, who are known to love billabongs, or poles. Perhaps they are cousins. Keep up the good work, Ben. Love reading your posts." Thank you, Robin Nunya. I am happy that you have enjoyed my content for so long, as I know you have been with my channel for a while now. Just so it's said, I did make a 2-part video on dangerous creatures found in Australia, and only one on the otterman. So, I think Australia does have some pretty dangerous animals? I am just kidding you, as I would love to visit there one day. It is interesting to think the yowie would be related to the otterman, since I always viewed it as a different version of Bigfoot. However, I was unaware that they love the water so much. Maybe there is a link there. Normally, I keep this section to 3, but I had to add one from a longtime fan of my content. Urban Shaman says, "Chewie would kick all their butts, while looking adorable the whole time." I loved it, Urban Shaman. This was in regards to ottermen being afraid of dogs. I actually considered putting an image of Chewie in that video at that point. Yet, you are right, he certainly would. The little guy is fearless and quite adorable. If you haven't yet done so, please do consider subscribing to my channel for content similar to this, and if you enjoyed this video, could you share my content with someone you know who may enjoy this type of genre? With that, be safe, and I'll see you in the next one.